The whispers began the day Ruth Helena turned 23 and threw a bucket of horse water on Mayor Callahan in front of the entire town square of Lusk, Wyoming. It was August of 1884, and the summer heat had made tempers short. But Ruth's patience had been tested beyond endurance when the mayor suggested for the third time that month that she ought to soften her manner if she ever wanted to catch a husband. The water had been cold, the mayor's dignity thoroughly soaked, and by sunset, half the saloons in town were taking bets on whether any cowboy in the entire Wyoming territory would ever be fool enough to marry Ruth Helena. She had not meant to become the town's favorite topic of gossip. Ruth had simply tried to live her life the way she saw fit, running her late father's blacksmith shop with capable hands and a sharp mind for business. When Thomas Helena had died 2 winters prior, everyone expected Ruth to sell the forge and find herself a husband who could provide for her. Instead, she had rolled up her sleeves, learned to work the bellows and hammer herself, and kept every single one of her father's contracts. The ranchers needed horseshoes. The miners needed tools. The railroad men needed repairs. Ruth provided all of it, and she did not apologize for the soot under her fingernails or the strength in her arms. But Lusk was a small town. Barely 2,000 souls clustered along the railroad line, and small towns had expectations for their unmarried women. At 23, Ruth should have been married with at least 1 child by now. Instead, she lived alone in the rooms above the smithy, kept company by her father's old hound dog, and showed no interest whatsoever in the occasional cowboy who worked up the courage to court her. She turned them all down, politely at first, then with increasing bluntness as they failed to take the hint. The betting pool grew throughout the autumn. By October, when the first cold winds came down from the mountains, there was nearly $500 in the pot. The rules were simple. Any unmarried man who could win Ruth Helena's hand in marriage before the year's end would take the money. It was meant as a joke, mostly, something for the ranch hands and railroad workers to laugh about over their whiskey. Ruth herself tried to ignore it, though the constant attention wore on her nerves like a rasp on rough iron. November brought snow early that year. The first flakes fell on the 3rd of the month, and by Thanksgiving, Lusk was already buried under 2 feet of white. The railroad still ran, though not always on time, and the stagecoach routes became increasingly unreliable as the mountain passes filled with ice and snow. Ruth kept her forge burning hot, providing a welcome source of warmth for anyone who needed to thaw their fingers while they waited for repairs. She did not mind the winter, actually. The cold kept most of the foolish suitors away, and she could work in relative peace. The cowboy rode into town on the 23rd of November, in the middle of a snowstorm so thick that most sensible people had shuttered their windows and stayed indoors. Ruth was working late, finishing a set of iron hinges for the new church door, when she heard the heavy footsteps on her porch. She looked up, hammer still in hand, as the door swung open and a snow-covered figure stumbled inside. "We are closed," Ruth said firmly, though she set down her hammer and moved toward the man. Even through her irritation, she could see he was half frozen, ice crusted on his coat and hat. "Need somewhere to warm up," the man said through chattering teeth. "Horse threw a shoe 2 miles back, been walking since." Ruth sighed and gestured toward the forge. "Come stand by the fire before you lose your fingers to frostbite. Where is your horse?" "Tied up outside. In this weather." "Are you trying to kill the poor animal?" Ruth did not wait for an answer. She grabbed her heavy coat from its peg and pushed past the stranger into the howling wind outside. Sure enough, a large bay gelding stood tied to her hitching post, shivering and covered in snow. Ruth untied the animal and led it around to the small stable she kept behind the shop, settling it in the empty stall with fresh hay and a blanket. By the time she returned to the forge, her face was numb and her hands ached with cold. The stranger had removed his hat and coat, hanging them near the fire to dry. He was younger than Ruth had first thought, perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that fell past his collar and a face that would have been handsome if not for the exhaustion etched into every line. His eyes, she noticed, were an unusual shade of green like new grass in spring. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for the horse. Any decent person would do the same." Ruth moved back to her workbench, eyeing the hinges critically. They still needed another hour of work, but that could wait until morning. "You have somewhere to stay in town." Was planning on the hotel, but I cannot say I know where that might be in this storm. Ruth glanced toward the window, where the snow was falling so thick that she could barely see the building across the street. She had lived through enough Wyoming winters to recognize a truly dangerous storm when she saw one. This was the kind of blizzard that killed travelers who lost their way between buildings. "The hotel is 3 blocks south, but you will get lost before you make it halfway there," she said, surprising herself with the offer that came next. "There is a spare room upstairs. You can sleep there tonight and find the hotel in the morning when the storm clears." The stranger looked at her with obvious surprise. "That is kind of you, miss. I do not want to impose." "You will not be imposing. You will be staying alive, which is preferable to me finding your frozen corpse on my doorstep come morning." Ruth moved to bank the forge, damping down the flames until they smoldered low. "I am Ruth Helena. This is my shop." "Harrison Northwood," the cowboy said and offered his hand. His grip was strong despite the cold, calloused in the way of someone who worked with ropes and reins for a living. "I am obliged for your hospitality, Miss Helena. Just Ruth is fine." She led him up the narrow stairs to the living quarters above the shop. The rooms were simple but clean. A small sitting area with a wood stove, a kitchen barely big enough for one person, and 2 bedrooms. Ruth showed Harrison to the spare room, which had been her father's before he died. "There are blankets in the chest. I will make coffee if you want some." Coffee would be welcome. They sat at the small kitchen table, warming their hands on tin cups filled with strong black coffee, while the wind howled outside and snow piled against the windows. Ruth found herself studying her unexpected guest with sidelong glances, curious despite herself. Harrison Northwood did not fit the mold of the usual cowboys who drifted through Lusk. He was quieter, more thoughtful, and he had not once made any comment about her living alone or working the forge. He simply drank his coffee and seemed grateful for the warmth. "What brings you to Lusk?" Ruth asked finally. "We do not get many travelers this late in the season." "Looking for work," Harrison said. "Heard there were some ranches in this area that might be hiring winter help. Most of the big ranches already have their crews set for the season. You might have better luck in Cheyenne." "Maybe so, but Cheyenne is still 2 days south, and I do not think my horse will make it that far before the real winter sets in." Harrison smiled just a little. "Besides, I do not mind small towns. They tend to be friendlier than the cities." Ruth snorted softly. "Lusk has its charms, I suppose, but friendly is not always the word I would use. People here like their gossip and their gambling more than anything else." "Gambling?" She hesitated, then decided he would hear about it soon enough anyway. "There is a betting pool in town. $500 to any man who can marry me before the new year. It is meant as a joke, mostly, but it has attracted every fortune hunter and fool within 100 miles. Harrison set down his coffee cup, his expression unreadable. "That seems like a cruel joke to make at someone's expense." "I have dealt with worse." Ruth lifted her chin, defensive. People think I should be desperate to marry since I run a business and live alone. They cannot understand why I would turn down perfectly good proposals from perfectly good men. Maybe they were not as good as people thought. The simple statement, delivered without judgment or pity, caught Ruth off guard. She found herself looking at Harrison more closely, noticing the way he held himself with a kind of self-contained stillness, as though he was comfortable in his own silence. "Why did you turn them down?" Harrison asked. "If you do not mind my asking." Ruth considered the question. Most people, when they asked, had already decided on the answer. They thought she was too proud, too stubborn, too particular. But Harrison seemed genuinely curious, and something about the late hour and the storm outside made her want to answer honestly. "Because none of them wanted to marry me," she said finally. "They wanted to marry my father's business, or they wanted a woman they could change into something more suitable. They wanted me to give up the forge, to stay home and cook and clean and have babies, to be the kind of wife this town thinks is proper. But I am not that woman, and I do not want to spend my life pretending to be someone I am not." Harrison nodded slowly. "That makes sense. A marriage should be a partnership, not a prison. You sound like you have given it some thought. My parents were partners, in the truest sense. My mother worked our ranch right alongside my father, up until the day she died. He never asked her to be anything but herself." Harrison's voice carried an old grief, well worn but still present. "They are both gone now, and the ranch with them. But I learned from them what a good marriage looks like, and I would rather stay single than settle for less." They talked for another hour, the conversation flowing more easily than Ruth would have expected with a stranger. Harrison told her about growing up on a small ranch in Montana, about losing his parents to influenza 3 years prior, and selling the land to pay their debts. He had been drifting since then, working as a ranch hand wherever he could find employment, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. Ruth, in turn, found herself talking about her father, about learning the blacksmith trade at his elbow, about the satisfaction of creating something useful with her own 2 hands. She told him about the loneliness of running the business alone, the way the town had turned her into a curiosity and a joke, the constant pressure to conform to expectations that felt like chains. "You should not have to change yourself to make other people comfortable," Harrison said. "Anyone who would ask that of you does not deserve you." The words settled into Ruth's chest with an unexpected warmth. She had been defending herself for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone simply accept her as she was, without criticism or suggestions for improvement. By the time they finally said goodnight, the storm was still raging outside, but Ruth felt somehow lighter than she had in months. She lay in her bed, listening to the wind and the creaking of the old building, and thought about green eyes and quiet understanding. The storm lasted 3 days. The snow fell without pause, piling up against buildings and burying the streets under drifts that reached past Ruth's waist. The entire town shut down, with only a few brave souls venturing out to check on neighbors and make sure no one was freezing in their homes. Ruth and Harrison were trapped together in the rooms above the forge, and Ruth found that she did not mind nearly as much as she should have. Harrison made himself useful without being asked. He kept the wood stove fed and burning, shoveled the snow away from the doors every few hours so they would not be completely buried, and even helped Ruth catch up on some of the bookkeeping for the business. He had a good head for figures, and a neat hand with pen and ink, and he worked through the ledgers with patient concentration. They cooked together in the tiny kitchen, making do with the supplies Ruth had on hand: beans and bacon, dried beef and potatoes, coffee, and the last of the bread she had baked the week before. Harrison turned out to be a better cook than Ruth, though she would never have admitted it out loud. He could make a simple stew taste interesting, and his biscuits were almost as good as the ones her father used to make. They talked, endlessly it seemed, about everything and nothing. Harrison told her stories about his travels, about the different ranches and towns he had seen, about the mountains of Montana and the plains of Kansas. Ruth described the intricacies of metalwork, explaining how different temperatures and techniques could produce different results, how iron had to be respected and understood if you wanted it to bend to your will. On the second night, Harrison asked if he could see the forge properly. Ruth led him downstairs, lighting the oil lamps that hung from the rafters, and watched as he examined the space with genuine interest. He asked intelligent questions about her tools and her methods, and when she offered to show him how to work the bellows, he followed her instructions carefully. "You have to find the rhythm," Ruth explained, demonstrating the steady pumping motion that fed air to the coals. "Too fast and you waste energy, too slow and the fire dies. It has to be consistent." Harrison took over the bellows while Ruth heated a piece of iron in the flames. When it glowed the right shade of orange, she pulled it out and carried it to the anvil, picking up her hammer with practiced ease. The ring of metal on metal filled the space as she shaped the iron with precise strikes, feeling Harrison's eyes on her as she worked. "That is incredible," he said when she finally plunged the piece into the water barrel, steam hissing up around them. "You make it look easy. It is not easy, it is just practice." But Ruth felt pleased by the admiration in his voice. Most men were either intimidated or dismissive of her skills. Harrison was neither. "Do you want to try?" She taught him the basics of holding the hammer, of letting its weight do most of the work, of hitting the iron at the right angle to shape it rather than simply flatten it. Harrison was clumsy at first, but he listened to her corrections and adjusted his technique without complaint or wounded pride. By the time they went back upstairs, he had managed to forge a simple nail, and he looked at the crooked thing in his palm with genuine satisfaction. On the third day, the snow finally stopped falling. The sky cleared to a brilliant blue, and the sun came out, making the endless white landscape glitter like crushed diamonds. Ruth stood at the window, drinking her morning coffee and watching as people began to emerge from their homes, digging out pathways and calling to their neighbors. "I should head to the hotel today," Harrison said from behind her. "Give you back your spare room and your privacy." Ruth turned to look at him. Over the past 3 days, she had grown accustomed to his presence in her home. The rooms felt more alive with someone else in them, and she had enjoyed their conversations more than she wanted to admit. The thought of him leaving created an unexpected hollow feeling in her chest. "You could stay another day," she heard herself say. "Make sure your horse is fully recovered from the journey. The roads will still be difficult for traveling." Harrison smiled, and Ruth realized it was the first real smile she had seen from him. It transformed his whole face, warming those green eyes and creating creases at their corners. "I would like that, if you are sure you do not mind." "I do not mind." They spent the day digging out the forge and the stable, working side by side in companionable silence. Other townspeople stopped by, ostensibly to check on Ruth, but really to get a look at the stranger who had weathered the storm with her. Ruth introduced Harrison with a minimum of fuss, and she tried not to notice the speculative looks and knowing smiles that passed between her neighbors. That evening, there was a knock at the door just as Ruth was preparing dinner. She opened it to find Samuel Winters, one of the town's more persistent suitors, standing on her doorstep with his hat in his hands and a determined expression on his face. "Evening, Ruth," Samuel said. I came to make sure you weathered the storm all right. I am fine, Samuel. Thank you for checking. Ruth did not invite him inside. Samuel had proposed to her twice over the past year, and both times she had turned him down as gently as she could. He was not a bad man, but he wanted a conventional wife, and Ruth knew she would make him miserable within a month. I heard you had a visitor staying with you during the storm. Samuel tried to peer past her into the apartment. That does not seem entirely proper, Ruth. People will talk. People are always talking, Samuel. It makes no difference to me. Ruth kept her voice level, though irritation prickled along her spine. Harrison needed shelter during the blizzard. I was not about to turn him out to freeze. Harrison, is it? You are on a first-name basis already. Samuel's expression darkened. Ruth, you need to think about your reputation. A woman in your position cannot afford to be careless. My position. Ruth crossed her arms. And what position is that exactly? You know what I mean. You are unmarried, living alone, running a business. People already think you are odd. If you add impropriety to the list, no decent man will want anything to do with you. Then I suppose it is fortunate that I do not particularly care what decent men want. Ruth started to close the door, but Samuel put his hand against it. Ruth, wait. I am not trying to insult you. I am trying to help. Samuel's voice took on a pleading tone. I know you turned me down before, but I have been thinking. With the betting pool and everything, men are coming to Lusk just to try their luck at marrying you. Most of them are fortune hunters or worse. But I am offering something real. I can take care of you, give you a proper home, let you leave this hard work behind. I do not want to leave this work behind, Ruth said firmly. How many times do I have to tell you that? I like my life, Samuel. I am not looking to be rescued. Every woman wants to be taken care of, Samuel insisted. You are just being stubborn because you think you have to be. But Ruth, you are 23 years old. How much longer do you think you can hold out? Eventually, you will have to accept reality and marry someone. Is everything all right here? Harrison's voice came from behind Ruth. She glanced back to see him standing in the doorway to the kitchen, his expression neutral but his body language alert. Samuel's eyes narrowed. This is a private conversation. It seemed like the lady was trying to end the conversation, and you were not taking the hint. Harrison moved to stand beside Ruth, not touching her but making his presence known. Maybe it is time you headed home, friend. I am not your friend, and you have no business interfering. Samuel looked between them, and his face flushed with anger and something uglier. I see what this is. You are here for the betting pool, are not you? You think you can sweep in and win $500 and a profitable business all at once. Well, it will not work. Ruth is too smart to fall for the act of some drifting cowboy. Samuel, that is enough. Ruth's voice cracked like a whip. You need to leave. Now. You are making a mistake, Samuel said, backing toward the stairs. When this stranger breaks your heart and takes everything you own, do not come crying to me. He clattered down the stairs and out into the street, slamming the door behind him hard enough to rattle the windows. Ruth stood rigid, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, fury and embarrassment warring in her chest. I am sorry about that, she said tightly. Samuel means well, mostly, but he cannot seem to understand that no means no. You do not need to apologize. Harrison's voice was gentle. And for what it is worth, he is wrong. About everything. Ruth looked up at him, and the understanding in his eyes made her throat tight. He thinks you are here for the money. I did not even know about the betting pool until you told me, and I have no interest in it whatsoever. Harrison hesitated, then added quietly, though I am starting to understand why you wanted to throw water on the mayor. Despite everything, Ruth felt a laugh bubble up in her chest. It was a satisfying moment, I will admit. They ate dinner together, and Ruth tried to push the encounter with Samuel out of her mind. But she could not quite shake the worry that Harrison would leave now, wanting to avoid being dragged into the town's gossip and speculation. She would not blame him. It was not his problem, and he had already been far kinder than most strangers would have been. But Harrison did not mention leaving. Instead, he helped her clean up after dinner, and they sat by the wood stove while Ruth mended a shirt, and Harrison read one of the books from her father's small collection. It felt domestic and comfortable, and Ruth realized with a start that this was what she had been looking for all along. Not someone to rescue her or take care of her, but someone who could simply be with her, sharing space and silence without needing to fill every moment with words or expectations. The next morning, Harrison went to the hotel and secured a room, but he returned to the forge later that day, asking if Ruth might have any work for him. The snow had disrupted supply lines and delayed shipments, and several of the local ranchers were desperate for repairs before the next storm hit. Ruth had more orders than she could handle alone, and Harrison's offer was well-timed. "I do not have much experience with metalwork," he admitted, "but I can learn and I am good with my hands. I can handle anything you need assistance with." Ruth considered the proposition. She had never hired help before, had always managed the forge on her own through pride and stubbornness. But the backlog of work was genuinely overwhelming, and she found that she liked the idea of having Harrison around for reasons that had nothing to do with business. "All right," she said. "I can pay you a fair wage and you can work whatever hours suit you, but I am warning you now, I am a demanding teacher and I do not tolerate sloppy work." Harrison grinned. "I would not expect anything less." He proved to be a quick learner and a tireless worker. Harrison took to the forge work with the same patient concentration he had brought to her ledgers, listening carefully to Ruth's instructions and practicing the basic techniques until his hands learned the rhythms. He was not a natural blacksmith, but he was methodical and determined, and he did not complain when the work left his arms aching and his hands blistered. Word spread quickly through Lusk that Ruth Helena had hired the stranger who had stayed with her during the storm. The gossip intensified, and the betting pool became more active than ever. Men Ruth had never seen before started showing up at the forge, trying to charm her or impress her with exaggerated tales of their accomplishments. She turned them all away with increasing impatience, and Harrison's steady presence became something of a shield against the most aggressive suitors. One afternoon, nearly a week after the big storm, a gambler named Jack Morrison showed up at the forge with an expensive suit and an oily smile. He had come from Cheyenne specifically for the betting pool, having heard about it through the gambling circuits, and he seemed to think that his city manners and smooth talk would win Ruth over where the local cowboys had failed. "Miss Helena," Morrison said, removing his hat with a flourish. "I have heard so much about you. They say you are the finest blacksmith in 3 territories and the most beautiful woman in Wyoming besides." "They are wrong on both counts," Ruth said without looking up from the wagon wheel she was repairing. "There are better blacksmiths in Cheyenne alone, and I have seen my own face in the mirror enough to know I am no beauty." Morrison laughed as though she had made a joke. "Such modesty! But come now, surely you can spare a few moments to speak with me. I have come a long way just for the chance to make your acquaintance. Then you wasted your time. I am busy, Mr. Morrison. If you need something repaired, you can leave it with my assistant. Otherwise, I will ask you to leave." "Your assistant?" Morrison's gaze slid to Harrison, who was working the bellows on the other side of the forge. "You mean the drifter you took in during the storm? My dear Miss Helena, surely you realize that he is only here because of the money. The moment he gets his hands on that betting pool, he will be gone, and you will be left with nothing." Ruth set down her hammer carefully, banking her temper with visible effort. "Mr. Morrison, I will say this once, so please listen carefully. I am not interested in you, or in any of the other fortune hunters who have come to Lusk thinking they can win me like a prize at the county fair. I am especially not interested in men who insult my friends in my own place of business. Now get out before I throw you out." Morrison's smile vanished, replaced by a sneer. "You are not as clever as you think, Miss Helena. You are going to end up alone and bitter, and you will have no one to blame but yourself. That sounds preferable to ending up married to someone like you." Ruth picked up her hammer again, dismissing him. "Close the door on your way out." After Morrison left, Harrison came over to where Ruth stood, still gripping her hammer tight enough that her knuckles showed white. "You handled that well," he said quietly. "I should not have to handle it at all." Ruth forced herself to relax her grip, setting the hammer down. "This whole thing is ridiculous. I just want to do my work and live my life without every man in the territory thinking he has some claim on me. For what it is worth, I think you are right to stand your ground. Those men do not see you as a person, just as an opportunity." Harrison hesitated, then added, "Though Morrison was wrong about one thing. You are beautiful, Ruth. Maybe not in the conventional way, but beautiful all the same." Ruth felt heat rise in her cheeks, and she busied herself adjusting the wheel to hide her reaction. She was not accustomed to compliments, especially not ones that felt genuine rather than calculated. "You do not have to say things like that. I am not saying it because I have to. I am saying it because it is true." Harrison's voice was matter-of-fact, as though he was simply stating an observable fact. "You have strength and intelligence and more courage than any 3 men I have ever met. That is worth more than a pretty face." Ruth looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw nothing but honesty in those green eyes. Something shifted in her chest, a feeling like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. She had been so focused on protecting herself from men who wanted to change her that she had not noticed when someone came along who seemed to like her exactly as she was. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more than you know." December arrived with more snow and temperatures cold enough to freeze the water in the horse troughs solid overnight. Ruth kept the forge burning almost constantly, both for the work and for the warmth it provided. Harrison had moved his few belongings into the small room at the back of the forge, claiming it was easier than walking back and forth from the hotel in the cold. Ruth did not argue, though she suspected his real reason had more to do with the way people were starting to make threats about the betting pool. The situation had grown uglier as the deadline approached. With only a few weeks left before the new year, the men who had wagered on winning Ruth's hand were getting desperate. There had been shouting matches in the saloons, a few fistfights, and one man had even tried to grab Ruth on the street before Harrison intervened. The sheriff had arrested the man, but the incident left Ruth shaken and angry in equal measure. "This has gone too far," Harrison said that evening, pacing the floor of the small back room. "Someone is going to get hurt, and I do not want it to be you. What am I supposed to do? I cannot control what other people choose to bet on." Ruth sat on the edge of the workbench, her arms crossed. "I thought about leaving town until the new year passes, but I will not be driven out of my own home and business by a bunch of fools. Maybe we could end the betting pool another way." Harrison stopped pacing and looked at her, his expression serious. "If you were engaged to someone, the pool would become void. The gamblers would have to accept that they lost and move on." Ruth stared at him. "Are you suggesting I fake an engagement? I am suggesting a real one, actually." Harrison took a breath, and Ruth could see the nervousness in the set of his shoulders despite his attempt at calm. "Ruth, These past few weeks have been the best I have known in years. Working with you, talking with you, just being near you. You make me want to stay in one place for the first time since I lost my parents, and I think maybe you feel something too, though I could be wrong about that." Ruth's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "Harrison, I do not know what to say." "You do not have to say anything right now. Just think about it." Harrison moved closer, close enough that Ruth could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. "I know this is sudden, and I know we have not known each other long, but I also know that what I feel for you is real. It is not about money or bets or proving anything to anyone. It is just about you and the way you make me want to be a better man." "I do feel something," Ruth admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have been trying not to, because it seems impossible that someone could come into my life and understand me so completely in such a short time. But I feel it, Harrison. When you are near me, I feel less alone than I have in years. Then marry me." Harrison reached out and took her hands, his calloused fingers warm against hers. "Not for the town, or the betting pool, or anyone else. Marry me because you want to build a life with someone who sees you and values you exactly as you are. I do not have much to offer except these 2 hands and this stubborn heart, but they are yours if you will have them." Ruth looked at their joined hands, thinking about everything that had happened since Harrison stumbled into her forge during that snowstorm. She thought about the easy conversations and the comfortable silences, the way he listened to her without judgment, the way he made her laugh even when she was furious at the world. She thought about how the forge felt warmer with him in it, how the work seemed less lonely when they labored side by side. "Yes," she said, and felt a smile spread across her face despite the tears suddenly blurring her vision. "Yes, I will marry you." Harrison let out a breath that might have been relief or joy or both, and then he was pulling her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. Ruth wrapped her arms around his waist and pressed her face against his shoulder, feeling safe and wanted and understood in a way she had never experienced before. When they finally pulled back, Harrison cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, gentle and careful as though she was something precious. Ruth kissed him back, pouring all her pent-up longing and hope into the gesture, and when they broke apart they were both breathing hard. "We should probably tell people before they hear it through gossip," Ruth said, though she made no move to step away from Harrison's embrace. "Let them gossip. I do not care what anyone thinks as long as you are happy." But Harrison smiled, and Ruth could see the same giddy joy she felt reflected in his face. "Though you are right. We should make it official. Should we tell the mayor first since he started this whole mess?" "Absolutely. I want to see the expression on his face when we tell him." Ruth laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. "Do you want to get married right away or wait until after the new year?" "I would marry you tonight if we could find a preacher willing to perform the ceremony. But it might be nice to wait a bit, give people time to get used to the idea." "Maybe after Christmas." They decided on December 28th, which would be after the holidays but before the New Year deadline that had made Ruth's life so complicated. The announcement of their engagement sent shockwaves through Lusk. Some people were genuinely happy for them, especially the women who had been Ruth's friends and supporters. Others were skeptical, convinced that Harrison was a fortune hunter who had simply been more clever than the rest. And a significant number were angry, having lost money when the betting pool was dissolved. The anger came to a head on December 15th, during one of the worst snowstorms of the season. Ruth and Harrison had been working late, trying to finish a rush order of tools for the railroad, when they heard shouting outside the forge. Harrison went to check while Ruth banked the fire, and she heard his voice raised in warning just before the door crashed open. Samuel Winters stood in the doorway, swaying slightly and reeking of whiskey. Behind him, Ruth could see two other men, both of them ranch hands who had been part of the betting pool from the beginning. "You think you are so clever," Samuel slurred, pointing an unsteady finger at Ruth. "You and your cowboy making fools of all of us. But I know the truth. This whole engagement is a sham, is not it? You just want to get out of the betting pool without actually having to marry anyone." "Samuel, you are drunk. Go home before you say something you will regret." Ruth moved toward the door, but Harrison stepped between her and the intruders. "You need to leave," Harrison said, his voice level but firm. "Ruth asked you nicely. I am not going to ask at all. Get out." One of the ranch hands, a burly man named Tom, pushed past Samuel into the forge. "You do not get to tell us what to do, Drifter. You rode into town and stole what belongs to us." "Ruth does not belong to anyone," Harrison said, and Ruth heard the edge of steel beneath his calm tone. "She is a person, not a prize. And if you were too ignorant to understand that, then you never deserved her in the first place." Tom took a swing at Harrison, but he was clumsy with drink and rage, and Harrison dodged easily. The punch connected with a wooden support beam instead, and Tom howled in pain, cradling his damaged fist. The second ranch hand lunged forward, and then everyone was moving at once. Ruth grabbed the nearest heavy object, which happened to be a horseshoe she had just finished forging, and stepped into the fray. She cracked the horseshoe across the second ranch hand's arm hard enough to make him yelp and stumble back. Harrison had Samuel by the collar and was propelling him firmly toward the door. "I do not want to hurt you," Harrison said, "but I will if you do not leave right now. All of you out." The sheriff arrived moments later, drawn by the noise, and arrested all three men for public drunkenness and disturbing the peace. He took statements from Ruth and Harrison, shaking his head at the whole sorry situation. "I am sorry about this, Ruth," Sheriff Morgan said. "This betting pool has brought out the worst in people. I should have shut it down from the start. It is not your fault, Ben, but I appreciate you taking care of this." Ruth glanced at Harrison, who had a cut above his eye and was already developing what would be a spectacular bruise. "Are you all right?" "I am fine." "You pack a mean wallop with that horseshoe, though. Remind me never to get on your bad side." Harrison smiled despite the blood trickling down his temple, and Ruth felt a surge of affection so strong it made her chest ache. After the sheriff left with his prisoners, Ruth cleaned Harrison's cut and pressed a cold cloth against the developing bruise. They sat close together by the forge, and Ruth found herself shaking with delayed reaction. "I hate this," she said quietly. "I hate that people think they have any right to me or my choices. I hate that you got hurt because of my life being turned into entertainment for the whole town." "Hey!" Harrison caught her chin gently, tilting her face up so she had to meet his eyes. "I do not regret a single moment, Ruth. Not the fight, not the gossip, not any of it. You are worth every bit of trouble, and I would do it all again in a heartbeat." Ruth kissed him then, fierce and desperate, needing to prove to herself that he was real and solid and here with her. Harrison kissed her back just as intensely, his hands tangling in her hair, and for a long moment the rest of the world fell away entirely. When they pulled apart, both breathing hard, Ruth rested her forehead against his. "I love you," she whispered. "I did not plan to, and I certainly did not expect it, but I love you, Harrison Northwood." "I love you too," Harrison said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "More than I thought it was possible to love anyone." They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in the warm glow of the forge while the snow fell outside and the wind howled through the streets of Lusk. Ruth felt at peace for the first time in months, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. The week before Christmas, Harrison surprised Ruth by revealing that he had been working on a wedding gift in secret. He led her to the back of the forge and unveiled a beautifully crafted iron gate. The metalwork formed into an intricate pattern of flowers and vines. "I wanted to make something that would last," Harrison explained, looking almost shy. "Something as strong and beautiful as you are. I thought maybe we could install it at the entrance to the forge, or wherever you want." Ruth traced her fingers over the delicate metalwork, marveling at the skill it must have taken. The gate was both functional and artistic, the kind of work that took patience and vision. "Harrison, this is incredible. When did you even have time to make this?" "I've been working on it at night after you go to bed. I wanted it to be a surprise." He came to stand beside her, his hand settling warm on her lower back. "Do you like it?" "I love it. It is the most thoughtful gift anyone has ever given me." Ruth turned to face him, rising on her toes to kiss him softly. "Thank you." Christmas came with clear skies and temperatures so cold that the snow squeaked underfoot. Ruth and Harrison spent the day quietly together, exchanging simple gifts and cooking a modest feast in the small kitchen above the forge. Ruth gave Harrison a new set of work gloves lined with soft leather, and a shirt she had sewn herself with careful stitches. Harrison seemed genuinely moved by the gifts, especially the shirt, which he put on immediately despite the fact that it was Christmas dinner and they were staying home. "No one has made me clothing since my mother died," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This means everything to me, Ruth." They held each other close that night, talking about their plans for the future. Harrison wanted to continue working at the forge, learning the trade properly so he could be a true partner in the business. Ruth wanted to expand, maybe hire another helper once they could afford it, and take on some of the more complex custom work that she had been turning away for lack of time. They talked about children, someday, and about building a proper house with a workshop attached. They talked about growing old together, their hands scarred and calloused from a lifetime of work they both loved. 3 days before the wedding, another massive snowstorm blew in from the north. This one was even worse than the storm that had brought Harrison to Lusk in the first place. The wind shrieked like a living thing, and the snow fell so thick and fast that visibility dropped to almost nothing. The entire town shuttered itself indoors, and Ruth began to worry that the preacher would not be able to make it to the church for the ceremony. The wedding was planned for the evening of December 28th, in the small church at the center of town. Ruth had invited only a handful of friends, not wanting a large spectacle, and Harrison had no family to invite. They had kept the preparations simple. Ruth had a new dress, plain but well made, and Harrison had purchased a suit from the general store that fit him well enough with a few alterations Ruth had made herself. But on the morning of the 28th, the storm showed no signs of letting up. Ruth stood at the window, watching the snow pile higher and higher, and tried not to let disappointment swamp her. "We can postpone," Harrison said from behind her. "The important thing is that we are together. The ceremony is just a formality." "I know, but I wanted it to be today. I wanted to start the new year as your wife, officially." Ruth leaned back against him as his arms came around her waist. "Is that foolish?" "Not foolish at all. I want the same thing." Harrison was quiet for a moment, then said, "What if we went to the church anyway? Even if no one else can make it, even if it is just us and the preacher. We could still get married, Ruth. We could still make it official." Ruth turned in his arms to look at him. "In the middle of a blizzard, Harrison, we could barely make it 3 blocks in this weather. It is too dangerous." "Maybe. But we both know how to handle winter storms, and the church is not that far. We could bundle up, take a rope to keep us tethered together so we do not get separated, and make our way there carefully." Harrison's eyes held a fierce determination. I am not saying we should do anything reckless, but if we are careful, we could do this. Today, like we planned." Ruth thought about it, weighing the risks against the desire burning in her chest to bind herself to this man who had come into her life like an unexpected blessing. The storm was dangerous, yes, but it was not impossible to navigate if they were smart about it. And the idea of marrying Harrison on the snowiest night of winter, proving to themselves and the town that their love was real and unstoppable, held a powerful appeal. "All right," she said. "Let us do it. Let us get married tonight, blizzard or not." They spent the afternoon preparing carefully. Ruth put on her new dress, a deep blue wool that was both beautiful and practical for the cold. She braided her hair and pinned it up, and allowed herself a moment of vanity to admire her reflection. She looked different somehow, softer and more hopeful than she had in years. Harrison dressed in his suit, and Ruth helped him with the collar and tie. He looked handsome and nervous and excited all at once, and Ruth felt her heart swell with love for this man who was willing to walk through a blizzard just to marry her on the day they had chosen. They wrapped themselves in every warm layer they owned: heavy coats and scarves and gloves, wool socks and sturdy boots. Harrison found a length of sturdy rope and tied one end around his waist and the other around Ruth's, ensuring they would not be separated in the whiteout conditions. They left a note for the sheriff, explaining where they had gone in case something went wrong and someone needed to find them. Then they stepped out into the storm. The wind hit them like a physical blow, stealing Ruth's breath and stinging her face with flying ice crystals. The snow was so thick that she could barely see Harrison, even though he was right beside her. They moved slowly and carefully, staying close to the buildings and using the rope to keep them connected. Every step was an effort, every breath a battle against the howling wind. It took nearly an hour to travel the 3 blocks to the church. By the time they stumbled through the front door, they were both half frozen and completely covered in snow. But they were together, and they were there. Reverend Thompson looked up from his Bible in shock as they burst into the sanctuary, trailing snow and wind. "Ruth, Harrison, what on earth are you doing out in this weather?" "We came to get married," Ruth said, her voice muffled by her scarf. "Today, like we planned." "Are you willing to perform the ceremony?" The Reverend stared at them for a long moment, then a slow smile spread across his weathered face. "Well, I will be. I have been a preacher for 30 years, and I have never seen a couple so determined to tie the knot. Yes, I will marry you. Let me get my book, and we will make this official." They removed their outer layers, shaking off the snow and stomping their feet to restore circulation. Ruth's hands were numb and her face felt like ice, but her heart was warm as Harrison took her hand and led her to the front of the church. Reverend Thompson opened his Bible and began the ceremony. The words were familiar and formal, the traditional vows that had bound countless couples together over the years. But when Harrison looked into Ruth's eyes and promised to love and honor her for the rest of his days, she heard the truth and conviction in every word. And when she made her own vows in return, she meant them with every fiber of her being. "You have rings?" Reverend Thompson asked. Ruth shook her head. "We did not have time to get them made." "That is all right. The rings are just symbols anyway. What matters is what is in your hearts." The Reverend smiled at them both. "Harrison Northwood, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward for better or worse, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Harrison said, his voice steady and sure. "And Ruth Helena, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward for better or worse, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Ruth said, and felt tears prick at her eyes despite her best efforts. Then, by the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming and the grace of God, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Harrison, you may kiss your bride." Harrison cupped Ruth's face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the roughness of his calloused palms, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her knees weak. She kissed him back, pouring all her love and joy and relief into the gesture, and for a moment she forgot entirely about the storm raging outside. When they pulled apart, Reverend Thompson was beaming at them. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Northwood. I have seen many weddings in my time, but I do not think I have ever seen two people more meant for each other. Now, you two had better stay here for the night. I have a small room in the back where you can sleep, and I will not have you trying to walk back to the forge in this storm. It is too dangerous." They accepted gratefully, too cold and tired to argue. The Reverend showed them to a tiny room at the back of the church, barely large enough for a narrow bed and a small stove. He built up the fire for them, wished them well, and left them alone. Ruth and Harrison stood in the small room, suddenly shy despite everything they had already been through together. They were married now, legally and spiritually bound, and the reality of it was almost overwhelming. "Hello, Mrs. Northwood," Harrison said softly, reaching out to take her hands. "Hello, Mr. Northwood," Ruth replied and felt a smile tug at her lips. "We really did it. We got married in the middle of a blizzard. We did, and I would do it again in a heartbeat." Harrison pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her and resting his chin on top of her head. "You are the most remarkable woman I have ever known, Ruth. I am the luckiest man alive." They stood like that for a long time, just holding each other and listening to the storm outside. Eventually, they undressed down to their undergarments, practical in the cold room, and climbed into the narrow bed together. They held each other close, sharing warmth and whispered conversations about everything and nothing. "I was so lonely before you came," Ruth admitted in the darkness. "I told myself I was fine alone, that I did not need anyone, but I was lying to myself. I needed someone who saw me, really saw me, and did not want to change me. I know what you mean. I have been drifting for so long, never staying anywhere, never letting myself care too much about anything. But from the moment I walked into your forge, I felt like I had found something I did not even know I was looking for." Harrison's fingers traced gentle patterns on her back. "You made me want to stop drifting, Ruth. You made me want to put down roots and build something that would last." They made love for the first time that night, tender and unhurried, learning each other's bodies with careful touches and whispered endearments. Ruth had been nervous, having never been with anyone before, but Harrison was patient and gentle, making her feel cherished and safe. When they finally came together, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, two people becoming one in the most fundamental way possible. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, warm despite the cold room and the storm still raging outside. "I love you," Ruth whispered into the darkness, "more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person." "I love you too," Harrison replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Today, tomorrow, and every day after that." The storm finally broke on the morning of December 29th. Ruth and Harrison emerged from the church into a world transformed by snow, everything buried under drifts that reached past their waists in places. The town was slowly coming back to life, people digging themselves out and checking on their neighbors. Word of their wedding spread quickly. Some people were delighted by the romantic story of the couple who had braved a blizzard to get married. Others were skeptical or resentful, still convinced that Harrison was some kind of con artist. But Ruth found that she did not care nearly as much as she once would have. She was married to the man she loved, And that was all that mattered. They spent the winter working side by side at the forge, building both their business and their life together. Harrison continued to learn the blacksmith trade, his skills improving steadily with practice and Ruth's patient instruction. They developed a comfortable rhythm, able to anticipate each other's movements and needs almost without speaking. The betting pool became a distant memory as other gossip took its place. Samuel Winters left town in late January, having taken a job at a ranch in Montana. The gambler Jack Morrison was arrested for card cheating in Cheyenne and was last heard to be serving time in the territorial prison. And Ruth's life returned to something approaching normal, though it was a new normal, one that included a husband she loved and a partnership that felt equal and right. Spring came late that year, with snow still on the ground well into April. But when the thaw finally arrived, it brought with it new opportunities. Word of Ruth's skill had spread beyond Lusk, and she began receiving orders from as far away as Cheyenne and Casper. Harrison proved to have a gift for the business side of things, handling correspondence and contracts with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. In May, Ruth realized that she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with a mixture of joy and terror. She had never been particularly maternal, had never spent much time thinking about children. But the idea of having Harrison's baby, of creating a new life together, felt right in a way she could not quite articulate. Harrison was overjoyed when she told him, picking her up and spinning her around the forge, despite her protests that she was too heavy and he would hurt himself. He became even more protective than he had been before, trying to take on the heavier work and worrying whenever Ruth lifted anything that seemed too large. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," Ruth told him one afternoon, exasperated but also touched by his concern. "I can still do my work." "I know you can, but that does not mean you should have to do all of it alone." Harrison set down the horseshoe he had been working on and came to stand beside her. "Let me help, Ruth. Let me take care of you just a little bit." Ruth softened, seeing the genuine worry in his eyes. "All right. But only a little bit. I still need to work, Harrison. It keeps me sane." They compromised, with Ruth handling the lighter work and the custom orders that required her particular expertise, while Harrison took on more of the heavy labor and the routine jobs. It worked well, and Ruth found that she actually enjoyed sharing the responsibility. It felt good to have a true partner, someone she could depend on without feeling like she was giving up her independence. The baby was born in January of 1886, during another snowstorm, though nothing like the blizzard that had raged during their wedding. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Ruth thought she might not survive it. But Harrison stayed with her the entire time, holding her hand and talking her through the worst of the pain. And finally, as dawn broke over the snow-covered town, their son was born. They named him Thomas Henry Northwood, after Ruth's father and with a nod to Harrison's own first name. He was a small, squalling bundle of fury and need, and Ruth fell in love with him instantly. Harrison held his son with trembling hands and tears streaming down his face, and Ruth knew that their family was complete in a way she had never imagined it could be. The next few years passed in a blur of hard work and simple joys. The forge continued to prosper, and Ruth and Harrison eventually hired a young apprentice to help with the workload. Thomas grew into a sturdy, curious child who loved the forge and would sit for hours watching his parents work, asking endless questions about the metal and fire. In the spring of 1888, Ruth discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and in October she gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Elizabeth. Sarah was quieter than her brother, but just as determined, and she showed early signs of inheriting Ruth's stubborn independence. Life settled into a comfortable pattern. The family lived in the rooms above the forge until 1889, when they finally had enough money saved to build a proper house on the edge of town. Harrison designed it himself, incorporating many of the lessons he had learned working with Ruth, and the result was a sturdy, practical home with large windows and a spacious workshop attached. Ruth's reputation as a blacksmith continued to grow. She began taking on more artistic commissions in addition to the practical work, creating beautiful gates and railings and decorative pieces that combined function with aesthetic beauty. Harrison developed into a skilled craftsman in his own right, and together they built a business that was respected throughout the territory. But more important than the business success was the life they built together. Ruth had been right all those years ago when she turned down the men who wanted to change her. What she had needed was someone who would accept her exactly as she was, someone who would stand beside her as an equal partner rather than trying to lead or control her. In Harrison, she had found that person, and the love between them only deepened with time. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Harrison surprised Ruth with a pair of wedding rings. He had been working on them in secret for months, forging them himself from gold he had saved up to buy. They were simple bands, engraved with the date of their wedding, and Ruth cried when he slipped hers onto her finger. "I know we did not need rings to make our marriage real," Harrison said, holding her close, "but I wanted you to have something that showed the world you are mine and I am yours." "I have always been yours," Ruth said, kissing him softly. "From the moment you walked into my forge during that snowstorm, I just did not know it yet." They stood together in the workshop of their home, surrounded by the tools of their trade and the life they had built, and Ruth felt a contentment so profound it was almost painful. She thought about the young woman she had been, angry and alone and convinced she would never find someone who understood her. She thought about the betting pool and the gossip, and all the men who had tried to win her like she was a prize. And then she looked at Harrison, at the man who had proven them all wrong simply by seeing her as a person rather than a conquest, and she felt grateful for every twist of fate that had brought them together. The years continued to pass. Thomas grew into a serious young man who apprenticed with his parents, and eventually took over much of the day-to-day operation of the forge. Sarah proved to have her mother's gift for metalwork and her father's head for business, and together, the two siblings expanded the enterprise beyond anything Ruth and Harrison had imagined. Ruth and Harrison grew older together, their hands becoming more gnarled with arthritis, their hair turning silver, their bodies wearing the marks of a lifetime of hard work. But the love between them never faded. They still held hands when they walked through town. They still talked late into the night, sharing thoughts and dreams and memories. They still looked at each other with the same wonder and gratitude that had marked their early days together. In the winter of 1904, 20 years after they had first met, Ruth and Harrison sat together on the porch of their home, watching the snow fall. They were grandparents now, with 3 grandchildren who visited often and filled the house with noise and laughter. The forge was still operating, though Thomas ran it now, with Sarah handling the business side of things. Ruth and Harrison had earned their rest, though they still could not quite stop themselves from offering advice and occasionally picking up a hammer to work on a particularly interesting project. "Do you remember the night we got married?" Ruth asked, her hand clasped in Harrison's as they rocked slowly in their chairs. "How could I forget? We walked through a blizzard just to say our vows." Harrison smiled, the expression creating familiar creases in his weathered face. "Everyone thought we were crazy. We probably were, a little bit. Ruth leaned her head against his shoulder, comfortable and content. But it was worth it. Every frozen step, every moment of fear that we would get lost in the storm, it was all worth it to marry you that night. The town wagered no cowboy would marry you, Harrison said softly. They thought you were too stubborn, too independent, too unwilling to change, but they were wrong about what marriage should be. It was never about changing you, Ruth. It was about finding someone who loved you exactly as you were. And you did. You proved them all wrong, Harrison, not by winning me like some kind of prize, but by being the kind of man I wanted to spend my life with. Ruth lifted her head to look at him, seeing the young cowboy he had been beneath the silver hair and lined face. I love you. Today, tomorrow, and every day after that, just like I promised all those years ago. I love you too, Harrison said and kissed her gently. Always and forever, Mrs. Northwood. They sat together as the snow continued to fall. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life together that was richer and more fulfilling than either of them had ever imagined possible. The town had made its bets and told its stories, but in the end, the only thing that mattered was the love between them, the partnership they had forged in fire and snow and unwavering commitment. Ruth thought about the girl she had been, throwing water on the mayor in defiance, refusing to apologize for who she was. She thought about all the men who had tried to court her for the wrong reasons, and the betting pool that had made her life miserable for months. And then she thought about the snowiest night of winter when a cowboy had walked beside her through a blizzard just to marry her, not because he wanted to win anything, but because he loved her. It had been a good life, Ruth reflected. A hard life in many ways, full of work and struggle and the everyday challenges of running a business and raising a family. But it had also been a life filled with love and respect and true partnership. She had never had to change herself or give up her dreams. She had found someone who valued her strength rather than fearing it, who supported her ambitions rather than trying to limit them. As the snow fell softly around them and the warmth of their home beckoned from behind the door, Ruth and Harrison sat together in perfect contentment, two souls who had found their match and built something beautiful together. The story that had begun with a wager and a snowstorm had become a love story for the ages, proof that the best marriages were not won through competition or conquest, but through mutual respect, understanding, and the willingness to see another person exactly as they were, and love them all the more for it. The town of Lusk, Wyoming would tell their story for generations to come. They would talk about the betting pool and the blizzard wedding, about the woman who ran a forge and the cowboy who loved her. But the real story, the one that mattered most, was simpler and more profound than any gossip or legend could capture. It was the story of two people who found each other when they needed it most, who built a life together based on equality and respect, and who proved that true love was not about winning or changing or conquering, but about accepting and supporting and standing together through every storm life could throw at them. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.